The Mongols are introduced as one of history's most feared military peoples, commanding a fighting force that terrified its enemies. Their empire is described in the source as one of the largest ever recorded, controlling 16% of Earth's land and stretching from Korea to Poland. That rise is tied above all to Genghis Khan, whose intelligence and military strategy helped transform steppe nomads into a powerful and respected people. Yet much of their story remained mysterious for centuries, and some parts are still debated. To understand how enormous Mongol power became, the story has to move backward through its origins, its wars, and its leaders. It also has to follow that power to a dramatic reversal, when a Mongol force that had conquered across Eurasia was ultimately humiliated in Java. The source traces the background of this story to the period from about 907 to 1125, when the Khitan formed the Great Liao Kingdom and fought to expand into Korea, China, and Central Asia. In 1125, the Jin dynasty defeated that kingdom, pushing part of the Khitan westward, where another state emerged. At the same time, nomadic peoples north of that region continued living on the steppe. Several of those tribes gradually united in a confederation called Khamag Mongol, whose name is presented as meaning a whole or united Mongol people. Among its tribes was the Borjigin clan, whose representatives were repeatedly chosen as Khans of the confederation. By the 12th century, Khamag Mongol had grown stronger, but a long rivalry with the Tatars weakened it. By the middle of that century, the confederation had fractured and was close to destruction. One surviving Borjigin leader was Yesugei, who tried to reunite the scattered tribes. In 1171, he arranged a diplomatic marriage for his 9-year-old son, Temujin, with Borte. The source says Yesugei died around the time of the marriage, and repeats an account that he may have been poisoned by Tatars. After his father's death, Temujin tried to inherit his position. Instead, his own people rejected him and exiled him with his family. The young Temujin lived in poverty and, according to the source, even spent 6 years enslaved. His determination to recover changed the direction of the story. Temujin sought help from his blood brother Jamuka, who helped him rebuild, and he also received support from Toghrul Khan of the Karaites. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka combined their forces and attacked rival tribes together. Their alliance eventually broke, not simply because of a struggle for power, but because the source presents them as representing different ideas about leadership. Jamuka favored the traditional Mongol aristocracy, which reserved high positions for people from the established elite. Temujin was willing to give authority to anyone he considered skilled, capable, and loyal, even when that person came from outside his own tribe. That policy made Temujin increasingly popular among other groups, and made Jamuka feel threatened. In 1187, Jamuka declared war and attacked with about 30,000 men. Temujin had only about 20,000 and was not fully prepared. He was decisively defeated in the battle identified by the source as Dalan Balzut, then disappeared from the historical record for roughly 10 years. He reappeared in 1197 as a leader in a coalition of Mongols, Karaites, and Jin forces fighting the Tatars. The source connects that campaign with Temujin's desire to avenge the reported poisoning of his father. The coalition defeated the Tatars and executed their leaders. Temujin, however, invited many non-aristocratic survivors to join his own forces. His leadership principle remained the same. Important positions went to people who proved their ability and loyalty, rather than merely their ancestry. That approach became a regional revolution in the source's telling. It drew more followers into his camp and prepared the foundation for a far more disciplined Mongol military system. As Temujin attracted more followers, he reorganized the Mongols into a stronger and more highly trained army. A force that had once numbered only tens of thousands grew into the hundreds of thousands in the source's account. He divided the army into tightly organized units and imposed severe discipline. Soldiers were forbidden to abandon one unit for another, and the stated punishment for desertion or unauthorized transfer was death, with punishment extending to comrades from the old unit. At the same time, soldiers could choose commanders within their own formations, while Temujin personally selected the commander who stood over the larger force. The resulting chain of command made the army more effective, disciplined, and loyal. In 1201, rival tribes gathered in a Kurultai and proclaimed Genghis Khan of the Mongols. Temujin rejected that decision, and a 5-year struggle followed. The source says Temujin eventually won the conflict known there as the Battle of the 13 Sides and removed his former blood brother from leadership. Afterward, Mongol leaders assembled and proclaimed Temujin their new ruler, giving him the title Genghis Khan. Under him, tribes that had fought one another were brought into a single political and military structure. Expansion followed. In 1209, the first major target described by the source was Western Xia. The record presented in the transcript is limited, but it says the Mongols won and struggled especially against fortified cities. Genghis Khan responded with siege tactics, leaving some cities to surrender after hunger and disease. The Western Xia ruler was forced to submit. For the Mongols, that victory demonstrated how formidable their new military organization had become. The Jin dynasty to the south initially continued to dismiss the Mongols as raiders disturbing its northern frontier. By 1211, that attitude had changed. The Jin recognized Genghis Khan as a serious threat and demanded that the Mongols stop their invasions. Instead of ending the conflict, the demand led to war. In March 1211, Genghis Khan called his allied tribal leaders together and prepared to face China. The disparity in numbers was enormous in the source's account. The Jin could field roughly 800,000 infantry, most of them described as poorly trained peasants, along with about 150,000 highly trained cavalry distributed among the Great Wall and separate fortresses. The transcript gives a total near 950,000 Jin troops across many positions. Against them stood only about 90,000 Mongol cavalry. But the source emphasizes that the smaller Mongol force was much better prepared for combat, combining foot soldiers, mounted archers armed with composite bows, and trained cavalry. Genghis Khan sent his army through the Great Wall region, a move that divided his strength. He led roughly 60,000 men himself, while about 30,000 under one of his sons moved toward Datong. Genghis headed for the strategic pass protecting Beijing, but huge Jin forces blocked his advance for months. With no progress, he changed the plan. He sent 2 trusted generals, Jebe and Subutai, with a smaller force to attack the western defenses from behind. Jebe and Subutai destroyed fortifications and troops on that front, then returned toward the main Mongol army. Once Genghis learned that the defensive line had been broken, he drove his forces against the Jin positions in the mountains. The Jin fell back. Genghis then sent troops through mountain routes the defenders had left unguarded, because they believed those passages could not be crossed. The Mongols crossed them anyway, turning what the Jin considered impossible terrain into another route of attack. The campaign was becoming a demonstration of the system Temujin had built. Smaller forces, rigid command, mobility, and commanders trusted to exploit opening. Genghis Khan's commanders continued using maneuver to break larger forces. Jebe used a characteristic feigned retreat, drawing Jin troops after him until they were separated into smaller groups that could be destroyed. Repeated maneuvers and tactical withdrawals helped bring the Mongols victory by 1213, even though weather and winter forced them to pull back more than once. The source describes the conquest in brutal terms. Many inhabitants were killed or enslaved, while doctors, priests, engineers, craftsmen, teachers, administrators, and merchants were often spared and absorbed because their skills were useful. Others were enslaved or used as human shields during later sieges. An epidemic struck while the Mongols were camped outside the capital, pushing Genghis Khan into negotiations with the ruling Jin emperor. Peace was agreed in exchange for tribute that included horses, plunder, and the emperor's daughter. The Mongols began leaving China with their spoils. Before they had fully crossed beyond the Great Wall, however, an envoy reported that the emperor had moved his court south to Kaifeng. Genghis interpreted the move as preparation for revenge. He returned to Beijing, besieged the city with the help of thousands of Chinese engineers, destroyed it, and carried its wealth back toward Mongolia. Mongol expansion then turned farther west. The source says Genghis Khan eventually forced about 20 powerful states to submit, but one defeated Naiman prince, Kublai, created a new obstacle. After defeats in 1205 and 1208, Kublai fled west and found protection near the western Liao realm. He married the ruler's daughter, then rebelled against his father-in-law and seized power in 1216. When Kublai attacked Al-Malik, a city under Genghis Khan's protection, Jebe was sent against him. Jebe won and the territory Kublai controlled passed into Mongol hands. That brought the Mongol frontier alongside the large Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by a Turco-Persian dynasty under Shah Muhammad. According to the source, Genghis Khan did not initially plan to invade it. He wanted friendly trade and sent a caravan carrying valuable gifts. At Otrar, however, the governor in Alchuk ordered the caravan arrested, accusing its mostly Muslim and Mongol merchants of being spies. When word reached Genghis, he sent 3 envoys to Shah Muhammad to explain the situation and demand the merchants' release. The Shah rejected the demand and killed one of the envoys. For Genghis Khan, the killing was a major insult. He gathered information about the enemy and prepared retaliation, again bringing siege engineers from China. His army was divided into several forces. The exact numbers remain disputed in the source, but it presents a common estimate of around 100,000 Mongol troops against roughly 60,000 Khwarezmian troops at the opening of the campaign. One Mongol force under Jochi, accompanied by Jebe, took about 20,000 men across the Tian Shan to strike the Fergana Valley. Another 20,000 under Chagatai and Ogede moved through a separate approach and besieged Otrar. After 5 months, a traitor opened a gate and the Mongols took the city. Many inhabitants were killed or enslaved. Otrar was leveled, and the source repeats a particularly brutal report that Governor Inalchuk was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. Shah Muhammad responded by concentrating defensive forces around Samarkand. Genghis Khan again chose a route his opponent considered nearly impossible, moving roughly 300 miles across the dry Kizilkum desert. The Mongols emerged near Bukhara, where defenses were weak and the city fell quickly. They then moved to Samarkand and began a siege in March 1220. The source says human shields were used to absorb enemy arrows during assaults on the fortifications. The Mongols also used another feigned retreat, drawing defenders out of the main battle area before turning on them. The maneuver helped destroy a large part of Samarkand's defense, including its war elephants. Shah Muhammad could not save the city and watched much of his force surrender. The Mongols occupied Samarkand, and the source estimates that about 100,000 residents were executed. Shah Muhammad and his son escaped. Subutai and Jebe were sent after them, beginning a long pursuit while Genghis Khan turned toward other cities in the Turco-Persian world. Genghis Khan next targeted wealthy Urgench, where conflict inside his own family became visible. His eldest son Jochi preferred negotiation and wanted to avoid destroying the city. Genghis wanted conquest and plunder, so Jochi was removed from command and replaced by his younger brother Ogdai. The dispute left Jochi increasingly estranged from the family. While that tension continued, Genghis Khan's youngest son Tolui led about 50,000 troops into Khorasan. Merv and Nishapur were captured, while Herat avoided the same fate by surrendering first. Meanwhile, Jalal-ad-Din, the son of Shah Muhammad, assembled about 60,000 Turkish and Afghan fighters. Genghis sent roughly 30,000 men under the Tata noble Sigi Kutuk against him. This time the Mongols lost. News of that defeat encouraged rebellions across the Turco-Persian territories, but Mongol forces quickly suppressed them. Jalal ad-Din's own coalition then fractured. With only about 20,000 troops left, he sought refuge toward India. Genghis pursued him, destroyed his remaining force, and drove him into flight. Another Mongol commander with 20,000 men was ordered to continue the pursuit into India, but the source says Jalal ad-Din was never found. Even so, the conquered region had been devastated. The transcript gives a dramatic population decline from about 2 million people to roughly 200,000. The campaigns then extended toward Georgia. Subutai had failed to catch Shah Muhammad, who escaped toward the Caspian Sea and died there, so the Mongol general raided nearby towns and villages for supplies. Raids in Georgia angered King George IV, who called a force of knights to fight him. At the battle identified in the source as Sagimi in 1221, Subutai used a feigned retreat and defeated the king's army. He then attacked and plundered areas in Azerbaijan and Iran. Continued pressure weakened Georgia until the Mongols were allowed to pass safely through the Caucasus. Beyond the mountains, Subutai confronted a coalition of Lezgians, Alans, Kipchaks, and Volga-Bulgars numbering more than 50,000. Rather than attack, the coalition waited for the Mongols to run out of food. Subutai's supplies were indeed becoming scarce. He answered with bribery, secretly paying the powerful Kipchaks to leave the alliance. Once they withdrew, he destroyed the remaining coalition and then sent troops after the Kipchaks as well, taking back the wealth used to buy their departure. Subutai's force later established a prosperous settlement on the Volga and expanded its campaign. He divided forces with Jebe and formed an alliance with Venice, receiving information about European kingdoms in return for assistance against Venice's enemies. Surviving Kipchaks sought help from the Rus principalities, described in the source as controlling lands in modern Russia and Ukraine. Together, they assembled about 60,000 men. Subutai and Jebe reunited their forces and sent envoys asking the Rus princes not to intervene, arguing that the conflict was only between the Mongols and the Kipchaks. The envoys were killed. War followed. The Mongol commanders again relied on deception, feigned retreat, and the breaking of the enemy into smaller groups. They defeated the coalition, then returned their forces toward Mongolia. They were soon sent against Western Xia, which had refused to contribute to Mongol campaigns. The source portrays Genghis Khan as unforgiving toward betrayal, and Western Xia became the target of that anger. During the campaign, Genghis fell from his horse and injured his shoulder. His condition worsened with a high fever. Advisors urged him to return to Mongolia and rest. But he refused and continued the war. This became his final campaign. After the fighting, Genghis Khan died on August 18, 1227, at the age of 66 according to the source. Leadership passed to sons who had been trained for rule. Long before his death, Genghis had assigned major regions among them, in an effort to preserve the empire. Mongolia to Tolui, Persia and Europe, to Jochi, Central Asia to Chagatai, and China to Ogedei, who became Great Khan. Ogedei proved especially capable in administration. Under him, the Mongol state became more tax-based. Karakorum was developed as a political center. Laws were expanded, a postal service was created, paper money was introduced, and civil service examinations were opened more broadly. The source also credits him with a policy of religious tolerance. Mongol invasions continued and reached deep into Europe, but expansion paused in 1241, when Ogedei died and the leadership became uncertain. Several Khans followed without producing the same decisive change until Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, emerged as ruler in 1260. He gained the throne only after defeating his brother Ariki in the 4-year Toluid Civil War, a struggle that exposed how dangerous succession had become inside the empire. The Toluid Civil War began with rival claims to the position of Great Khan. Arik's position weakened as allies turned against him, and he eventually met Kublai to surrender and recognize his brother's authority. But the contest had already contributed to the wider fragmentation of the Mongol world. Kublai also shifted the center of power. He abandoned the old capital and moved his government to Khanbalik, or Dadu, the city that would become Beijing. In 1271, Kublai declared himself emperor and gradually transformed his realm into the Yuan dynasty, adopting a more Chinese style of rule rather than governing simply as a steppe Khan. The source credits his government with establishing 20,000 public schools, preserving many arts, broadening knowledge through contact with influential visitors such as Marco Polo, issuing new paper and silver currency, and building about 400 postal stations to support communication and trade. His government became highly centralized and efficient in the transcript's portrayal. Kublai also strengthened the military and developed a naval arm by recruiting experienced sailors from northern China and Korea. He shared his grandfather's ambition for expansion, especially the desire to complete the conquest of China. A naval force with about 70,000 trained Marines was used on Chinese rivers to restrict enemy movement. After years of fighting on land and water, Kublai's forces gained full control of China in the source's account. He also forced the Goryeo dynasty in Korea into submission by 1273. Japan proved different. Kublai tried to extend his power there, but the Japanese emperor rejected him and war followed. The Mongols failed to conquer Japan, and the losses were heavy. The source says those defeats weighed on Kublai mentally. By his 70s, he was frequently ill and deeply depressed, a condition made worse by the deaths of people close to him. Looking for a new purpose, Kublai turned towards Southeast Asia. He sought campaigns in Vietnam, Burma, and Java, and the transcript describes all of those ambitions as ending in failure. The defeat in Java is presented as the most humiliating of them. To explain it, the source moves to 13th century Java, where much of East Java and parts of Sumatra and Kalimantan were associated with the kingdom of Tumapel, better known as Singasari, founded by Ken Arok. The transcript then warns that different historical versions exist. In the Chinese version summarized by the source, Kublai sent an envoy named Meng Qi to Singasari in the 1200s, demanding submission. The king was Kartanagara, who had ruled since the 1260s after his father. The source describes him as a proud ruler and a committed practitioner of Tantric Buddhism, with ambitions to extend his influence into eastern Sumatra and much of Java. In its framing, those ambitions also meant control over trade and spice routes. Kartanagara had no interest in sharing authority or profits with Kublai through tribute. The Nagarakirtagama is cited in the transcript as saying that his refusal to send tribute and acknowledge Mongol sovereignty angered Kublai. At the same time, the source notes that medieval Javanese and Balinese accounts do not describe the alleged killing of Menkaido Netgarden. Chinese records from the Yuan and Ming traditions instead say that Kartanagara insulted the envoy, branding his face with hot iron and cutting his nose, while another version says the envoy was killed. The transcript does not decide which version is correct. It only concludes that Kublai regarded whatever happened as a grave insult. The source gives Kartanagara's calculation as simple. He wanted to preserve trade with China without increasing tribute, and he believed Java's distance placed it beyond the easy reach of Kublai's armies. He apparently expected tensions eventually to cool, after which an apology and normal trade could resume. Kublai saw the matter differently. He prepared an expedition despite the obvious danger of attacking an unfamiliar island with very limited information. The transcript portrays Kublai's depression as affecting his judgment. Rather than carefully balancing the risks, he focused on the idea that a ruler of a distant island had no right to insult a ruler who claimed universal power. He ordered an attack on Singasari and the punishment of Kartanagara. A different account preserved in Javanese and Balinese traditions is also mentioned. In that version, a minister named Warara asked Kublai for military help after Jayakatwang of Kadiri seized Kartanagara's throne. Mongol forces then helped defeat Jayakatwang. Kartanagara died in the upheaval, and his son-in-law Radenwaya became the successor. The source says a princess was supposedly offered to Kublai in return for the help. It nevertheless states that Chinese records are more commonly relied upon, while acknowledging that Javanese material offers other possibilities. Whatever version is followed, the invasion fleet described by the source was prepared in 1292. It contained roughly 20,000 troops, many from southern China, carried aboard about 1,000 ships. The expedition brought enough grain for a year and 40,000 ounces of silver to buy additional supplies. Gao Xing commanded troops, Yigmis commanded naval elements, and the overall Mongol commander was Shibi. The three men went directly to Kublai before departure to receive his final instructions. Kublai instructed Shibi to leave naval matters to Yigmis and to control the political message once the expedition reached Java. The army was not supposed to announce that it had come simply to conquer the island. Instead, it was to say that its purpose was to punish Kartanagara and demand compensation for the treatment of the envoy. The source presents this as a cautious strategy for entering unfamiliar territory and facing an enemy the Mongols did not understand well. A show of overwhelming force might be enough to create submission without a costly war. The fleet sailed in the winter of 1292 and reached the waters off Java in March 1293. It did not immediately land in full strength. A diplomatic mission went ahead to demand surrender and avoid battle. The commanders agreed that if no satisfactory answer came within a week, they would begin military action. Instead, they discovered that their entire plan had already been overtaken by events. Katanagara was dead, killed during a rebellion led by Jayakatwang, whose power base is placed by the source in the Katiri region. Singasari had fallen, and Raden Wijaya, Katanagara's son-in-law, was emerging as the ruler associated with Majapahit. The Mongols had arrived in the middle of a Javanese civil war between Raden Wijaya and Jayakatwang. After a week of uncertainty, the fleet moved closer to Tuban. Troops under Gao Xing and Yigmis went ashore and advanced, while Alpha forces remained aboard ships under another commander. The naval element moved through the Madura Strait and later rejoined the land force. Jayakatwang's navy blocked movement on the Brantas River, but initially took no direct action against the foreigners. Mongol commanders held a banquet and invited Javanese representatives to discuss diplomatic terms. No meaningful response came. The Mongols moved forward, and Jayakatwang's naval forces withdrew without fighting. That allowed the invaders to occupy a fort with little resistance and push inland along the Brantas. There they met envoys from Raden Wijaya. He asked the Mongols for help, saying he lacked enough military strength to stop Jayakatwang, who was moving against Majapahit. In return, Raden Wijaya promised that he would submit to Kublai. The Mongol commanders saw the proposal as a path to achieving their objective in Java, without suspecting what would follow. Yigmis ordered Gao Xing to take part of the army and intercept Jayakatwang, while the remaining troops reinforced and defended Majapahit. Jayakatwang initially avoided Gao Xing and reached Majapahit. The source presents the earlier clashes as having weakened and exhausted his force, leaving it easier for Yigmis to defeat when it arrived. Jayakatwang's troops were driven away from Majapahit. Raden Wijaya again promised complete submission if the Mongols would help eliminate his rival permanently. The commanders agreed. After receiving maps from Raden Wijaya, the combined forces moved against Jayakatwang's capital at Kadiri. Mongol ships advanced along the Brantas while Gao Xing and Yigmis led troops on opposite banks. A large Majapahit force followed under Raden Wijaya himself. They reached Katiri within days and found Jayakatwang prepared with a substantial army. Fighting lasted from morning until afternoon. Jayakatwang's troops were driven back and split apart. Some fled across the river, while others withdrew into Kadiri with their ruler. A combined Mongol and Majapahit assault brought Kadiri close to destruction. Jayakatwang surrendered. For a brief moment both Majapahit and the Mongols could claim victory, and the Mongol force appeared to have secured the submission it had crossed the sea to obtain. Raden Wijaya then said his promised surrender had to be formally completed in Majapahit. He was allowed to return under the escort of a small unarmed Mongol detachment, while most Mongol troops were sent back toward the coast. Jibi and Gao Xing remained in Kadiri with only a smaller force. The Mongol commanders believed Java had effectively been conquered. Raden Wijaya had another plan. He waited until his escort was vulnerable, destroyed it, returned to Majapahit, and mobilized Javanese forces to drive the Mongols from the island. Shibi and Gao Xing escaped the trap at Kadiri, but had to fight their way toward the coast. The source says about 3,000 Mongol troops were lost during the retreat. Once back at the ships, the commanders debated whether to counterattack or withdraw. They chose withdrawal to avoid even greater losses. The expedition carried away valuables and information, including heirlooms, a map of Java, population records, spices, gold, silver, rhinoceros horn, and prisoners. But the source says those gains did not cover the cost of the campaign, and the defeat remained humiliating. Kublai was furious. The commanders were punished, losing a third of their property and receiving 50 strokes with a staff according to the transcript. The source then characterizes the Javanese resistance as unusually effective because it imposed major costs on the Mongols with relatively limited expenditure of its own forces. Kublai died in early 1294, His successors no longer showed the same desire to avenge the defeat in Southeast Asia. Radimwaya now secure enough to expand his authority across territory, described by the source as covering much of modern Indonesia and Malaysia. Later sent envoys to the Yuan dynasty and resumed trade relations. After Kublai, Timur Khan took the throne. The empire continued to weaken through internal fragmentation, civil war, pressure from outside powers, and economic decline. The source places its decisive endpoint in 1368, after the Mongol realm had already broken into 4 major states that fragmented further. Yuan rule then collapsed under resistance from the Ming dynasty. The empire, introduced at the beginning as controlling 16% of Earth's land, had passed from steppe unification to continental conquest, succession struggles, maritime ambition, defeat in Java, and finally political fracture.